The gavel slammed and Judge Whitmore barked an order that stunned the courtroom. Arrest that black attorney in seconds. David Carter, there to defend his client, was dragged away like a criminal, his only crime being the color of his skin and the courage to speak. Gasps filled the room, but fear kept most mouths shut. How could a judge twist justice so brutally, not knowing the man he tried to break was already bound for the Supreme Court? If this injustice stirs you, hit like and share. Now let's step inside and see how it all unfolds. I was there when David Carter pushed open the heavy door and stepped into that small county courtroom. He wasn't a famous attorney. Most folks in that room had never heard his name, but he carried himself like a man who understood why he'd come. Beside him, Lena Morris kept both hands on the strap of her purse, squeezing so hard her knuckles went pale. She'd been accused of shoplifting from a neighborhood store, thin evidence, thinner patience. If she lost, the state could take her little girl. You could feel the stakes in the way Lena breathed, shallow, careful, trying not to break. Just before he crossed the threshold, David paused at the hallway bench. A courier in a navy jacket had handed him a long envelope stamped from Washington. No ceremony, just a signature and a nod. I saw him tuck it inside his case without a word. He didn't announce it, didn't show anyone. The paper edge flashed for half a second and disappeared. Later, people would talk about that moment like it was a prophecy. At the time, it felt like the kind of detail you only notice when the world slows down, right before it turns. Inside, the room smelled like dust and old varnish. The ceiling fan wobbled as if it had a secret. Judge Whitmore took the bench with the easy confidence of a man who'd never been told no. He was pale and sharp-eyed, his robe pressed so flat it looked ironed onto him. When he read the docket and reached David's name, something changed in his expression, like he'd spotted a loose thread he meant to pull. "Counsel," announced the clerk said. David rose. "David Carter for the defense, Your Honor." Whitmore tilted his head as if he'd misheard. "Mr. Carter," he said slowly, "you are an attorney licensed to practice in this state." "Yes, Your Honor." The judge's mouth tightened into something close to a smirk. "We've had trouble lately with people overreaching." He leaned forward. "Let's save the court some time. Recite for me from memory the controlling provision, Rule 14, as applied to pretrial dismissal." "Now!" The words hit the room like a stray slap. A couple of folks in the back shifted, eager for a show. Officer Grant, the bailiff, a broad-shouldered man with a jaw like a doorstop, turned a lazy circle with the handcuffs around his finger. The metal clicked each time it looped a cold little clock inside the heat. David didn't flinch. He looked at the judge, steady and calm, and recited the language clean, precise, not a syllable dropped. You could hear the training in his voice and the discipline that gets built in long nights in quiet apartments. He finished and let the words settle. Whitmore blinked once, then smiled without warmth. "Well, you can memorize a pamphlet." He waved a hand. "We'll see if you can practice law." The first sting was the hardest to watch because it came dressed as civility. A few chuckles drifted from the rows behind me. Lena hunched, shrinking as if the bench could swallow her whole. She leaned toward David, voice barely there. "If I lose," she whispered, "my little girl, she won't have anyone." She didn't cry. She didn't have room for it. David angled his shoulder toward her, just enough to say he'd heard. "We're here for the truth," he murmured. That was it. No speech, no grand promise. Just enough to keep a person breathing. He began with the basics, the receipt that didn't match the timestamp, the clerk who couldn't keep his story straight, the camera that conveniently malfunctioned for 8 minutes. He laid it out like a carpenter, setting level, steady, careful, square. Each point had a weight to it, and you could feel the case inch toward balance. Whitmore wouldn't have it. He cut in before David finished a sentence. "Counsel, spare us the theatrics." Then again, sharper. "You're not on the debate team, Mr. Carter. This is a court of law." He turned to the prosecutor with the politeness he'd withheld from David. "Any response?" The prosecutor cleared his throat and offered one thin objection that sounded more like a shrug. Grant kept spinning those cuffs. That was when the air shifted, minute 2, minute 3, if you were counting. The judge drummed his fingers. "I am not inclined to indulge dilatory tactics," he said, eyes on David as if he were diagnosing a disease. "Frankly, I don't appreciate being lectured." "With respect, Your Honor." David said, "I'm not lecturing. I'm defending my client. Whitmore's gavel landed so hard the clerk jumped. Watch your tone. He let the silence stretch, tasting the room's discomfort, then leaned back. Tell me, Mr. Carter, what makes you think you're qualified to instruct this court on procedure? David held the line. The law, Your Honor. A hiss of laughter slid from somewhere behind me. The sound wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. That's the thing about humiliation. Once it starts, it finds its own volume. You could see it on the faces in the rows. A few smirks, a few tight jaws, a few eyes that wouldn't look up. A woman in a church hat shook her head, lips pressed together the way people do when they're trying to hold the world inside. Lena's hands trembled against her purse strap. Please, she said so soft that only the wood hurt her. Please. David returned to his points. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He took the fragments of a small life receipt's timestamps, the routine errand that becomes a record, and he tried to stitch dignity back into them. Little by little, the murmurs thinned. Even the fan seemed to have lost interest in its own wobble. Whitmore stared down at him with a patience so tight it was almost cruel. Enough. If you have a motion, make it and sit. I move to dismiss for lack of probable cause, David said. I can brief it by close of business. I don't need your homework. The judge's smile flickered mean and quick. Denied. Grant's cuffs clicked again closer, now an inch from David's shoulder. He didn't touch him yet, but he didn't have to. The message was in the sound. David inhaled as if he were drawing a line down the middle of his chest. Then I asked to be heard on the record regarding Mr. Carter. Whitmore snapped, You are wandering into contempt. I remember thinking how thin a line can be when one man holds the chalk. The room held its breath. Somewhere a shoe creaked against tile. Somewhere a throat cleared and decided against courage. It's not that people didn't see. It's that everyone understood what seeing could cost. David didn't bow. He didn't bristle. He squared himself between a frightened mother and a judge who had already chosen a side. Your Honor, he said quieter now. My client deserves a fair hearing. The judge's gaze slid past him to Lena, briefly dismissively and back. This court will decide what's fair. He tapped the gavel once, a warning more than a ruling. Proceed carefully. Outside the window, a siren rose and fell more distant than it sounded. Inside, the envelope from Washington rested in David's case, a silent witness to a future the room hadn't imagined yet. He hadn't pulled it out. He hadn't even looked at it again. But it was there, the way a storm is there, before the first wind touches the trees. Grant shifted his stance, bored or hungry for something to do, I couldn't tell. The cuffs hung still at last, as if the metal itself had decided to wait. Lena's fingers finally loosened. She let out a breath she'd been holding since the doorway and stared straight ahead at nothing at Hope. If you ask me what I remember most, it isn't the insults or the smirks. It's the quiet. The stubborn, ordinary quiet of a man who refused to be smaller than the truth. In a room that wanted a spectacle, David Carter chose to be steady. And that steadiness, more than anything, is what pushed the story toward a place none of us expected. David began his argument with calm precision, his voice steady, though the air in that courtroom felt stacked against him. He laid out the inconsistencies in the case against Lena Morris, the mismatched receipts, the blurry footage, the cashier's shifting story. He wasn't raising his voice, wasn't putting on a show. He was doing what any attorney should, defending his client. But Judge Whitmore didn't let him get far. Every time David tried to build a point, Whitmore cut him down. Mr. Carter, that's irrelevant. Mr. Carter, stay within your lane. Finally, with a cold smile, you don't belong here. You are not qualified to instruct this court. The words echoed harder than the gavel. They weren't rulings. They were daggers. That was when Officer Grant stepped closer, his boots striking the floor in heavy, deliberate thuds. He leaned just close enough for David to hear his voice low and taunting. Around here, the law doesn't belong to men like you. The metal cuffs in his hands swung in a lazy circle, clicking against themselves, as though already rehearsing for what was to come. David didn't answer. His lips pressed tight, but his eyes betrayed the storm inside. He had heard words like that before. Words that stripped not just authority, but dignity. And in that moment, a memory pulled him back years into a gymnasium with folding chairs and a high school banner drooping above the stage. He was 16, standing tall in a borrowed blazer, ready to represent his school in the final round of the debate tournament. He had practiced for weeks, memorized every fact, every line of argument. but he never even got to speak. The coach pulled him aside, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "David, it wouldn't look right. A black boy can't represent us on stage." He remembered the way the auditorium lights flickered against the polished trophy they handed to another student. He remembered his mother's quiet anger, his father's silence. That day he had walked home in the rain, his blazer soaked, his notes crumpled in his pocket. He never forgot the taste of it, not failure, but exclusion. And now, years later, that same taste was back in his mouth. For a second he faltered. His shoulders dipped almost imperceptibly under the weight of it. I could see it, the thought crossing his mind. Maybe it isn't worth it. Maybe the judge is right. Maybe no matter how hard I argue, I'll always be standing on the wrong side of the line they drew before I was born. And yet right then Lena shifted beside him. She wasn't speaking loudly. Her lips barely moved. But I caught the whisper, "If I lose, my little girl loses me." Her words were not polished or rehearsed. They were raw. They carried the weight of a mother's fear, the kind that comes from knowing a system is ready to swallow her whole and leave her child behind. David blinked and something in him steadied. His doubt didn't vanish. It hardened into something else. He thought of Lena's daughter, big brown eyes clinging to her mother's skirt the day they walked into his office. That child's future sat on his shoulders now. He turned back toward Whitmore, straightened his notes, and cleared his throat. His voice didn't rise, it deepened. "With respect, Your Honor, this case cannot be sustained by flimsy testimony and broken evidence. My client deserves more than suspicion. She deserves justice." The courtroom reacted in murmurs. Some smirked at his persistence, amused that he dared challenge Whitmore. Others sat stone-faced, unwilling to pick a side. There was a man in the back row who lowered his gaze as if ashamed to watch. A woman with gray hair shook her head slowly, her lips pressed thin, carrying decades of her own bitter memories. Whitmore's gavel struck. "Enough. This court will not be lectured by you." His tone was dripping with disdain, more personal than professional. The silence that followed was heavy. You could feel the room dividing itself, those who quietly agreed with David, but wouldn't risk speaking, and those who enjoyed watching him push toward the edge. And in the middle of it, David Carter, a man who had been told his whole life he didn't belong, stood still, absorbing every cut, every insult. I'll tell you the truth, he wasn't perfect. You could see the conflict on his face. A lesser man might have broken under it, and David almost did. But what held him there, what kept him standing, was not pride. It was responsibility. He wasn't fighting only for himself anymore. He was fighting for Lena, for her daughter, and for the quiet eyes in that room who were tired of being silent. That was when I realized his strength didn't come from being unshakable. It came from knowing he could be broken and refusing to let that stop him. The turning point came faster than anyone expected. David had been calm, steady, pressing his points with the kind of quiet insistence that made even the disinterested lean forward. But every time he spoke, Judge Whitmore cut in his voice, dripping with irritation. At last, when David dared to insist that Lena's case deserved a fair hearing, Whitmore's patience snapped. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. "Mr. Carter, you are disrupting these proceedings. You are wasting this court's time. This behavior borders on contempt." His eyes narrowed to slits. "I will not allow you to grandstand. Bailiff, arrest him. Now!" For a moment, the whole room froze. You could feel the disbelief roll like a wave across the benches. "Arrest him for defending his client." Then Officer Grant moved. The bailiff's boots struck the floor with a dull rhythm as he crossed the room. His hand clamped down on David's shoulder, heavy, merciless. He shoved once hard enough that David stumbled against the table. The sound of steel followed handcuffs snapping open metal, clinking like a verdict already passed. The noise ripped through the silence, sharp and final. Lena's cry broke next. "No, he hasn't done anything wrong." She shot up from her seat, hands trembling, her voice breaking on each word. "He's following the law. He's the only one here following the law. Why are you taking him?" Her words tumbled into sobs, raw and pleading. Whitmore didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He had already decided what mattered in that room, and it wasn't her or the law. That's when I heard a voice behind me. A woman, black, maybe in her 50s, whispered, just loud enough to carry, "I've seen this before." And I stayed silent. Her voice wasn't angry. It was heavy, like each word had been carved from regret. You could tell it was memory, not just observation. She had lived through this, maybe too many times. The room rippled. Some people gasped, a few muttered in protest. A young man in the corner half rose from his seat before his friend yanked him back down. There were scattered voices, small, fragile attempts at resistance, but they were drowned by a greater silence. Most people lowered their eyes, shoulders tightening, as if by looking away they could make themselves invisible. That's the thing about fear in a courtroom. It spreads faster than anger. Grant twisted David's arm behind him, the cuffs catching the light as he prepared to close them. The crowd watched, breath held, as if no one quite believed what they were seeing. David Carter, an attorney standing in his own role, being handled like a criminal for daring to speak. But David didn't thrash. He didn't plead. He didn't even look at Grant. His knees bent as the bailiff forced him downward, pressing until he was nearly on the floor. And yet he kept his gaze locked on Whitmore. It wasn't defiance in the loud, reckless sense. It was something quieter, sharper. His eyes said, "You can drag my body down, but you will not bend the truth with it." The stare between them was so strong the air seemed to thicken. Whitmore looked back, his lips curling into that thin, practiced smirk. But there was something else there, too. A flicker, small but undeniable. Because when a man looks straight through humiliation and still refuses to break it, unsettles even those who think they hold all the power. The cuffs clanged shut. The sound made Lena flinch as if struck herself. She cried out again, her hands pressed against her mouth, muffling a sob that echoed against the wood-paneled walls. From the back, a voice tried to protest. This isn't justice. But it was swallowed by the judge's glare, by the rustle of coats as people shifted nervously in their seats, by the quiet decision of most to do nothing. I watched it all, and I'll tell you this, that silence screamed louder than any gavel. It was the silence of neighbors, jurors, citizens who knew something was wrong, but feared what it would cost to say so. David's knees touched the cold tile. Grant's grip pressed him down the chain between the cuffs, rattling, and still his eyes never left Whitmore. A silent fire burning hotter than any outburst could. It wasn't pride. It wasn't arrogance. It was the simple, immovable truth: I am not beneath you, even if you force me to kneel. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, satisfied, the gavel resting like a scepter in his hand. To him, it must have looked like victory. A black attorney's silence bent at the knees before his court. To me and to anyone truly watching it was something else entirely. It was the image of injustice laid bare, so stark it left you no place to hide. That moment changed the room. People might not have spoken, but they felt it. The woman who whispered, "I stayed silent," folded her hands tighter, her jaw trembling. The young man who almost stood pressed his fists into his knees, eyes locked on the floor. And Lena's sobs grew quieter, but her eyes burned brighter. Her fear was turning into something else, anger, resolve. Grant pulled David fully upright, forcing him to stand even with the cuffs biting his wrists. David's suit was wrinkled, his tie askew, but he didn't look broken. Not to me, not to anyone willing to really see. And in that silent standoff, David chained Whitmore, smirking. The true battle began. It wasn't about motions or evidence anymore. It was about dignity, about who gets to stand tall in a courtroom and who is forced to kneel. I swear to you, you could feel the story shift right there. The judge thought he had won, but everyone else in that room, whether they admitted it or not, had just witnessed something they would not forget: a man humiliated but unbroken. And that unspoken defiance lit a fuse that the judge himself would never see coming. They led David through a narrow hallway, past doors that smelled of dust and cold metal, until they reached a holding cell tucked behind the courtroom. The sound of the key sliding into the lock was harsh, final. The door clanged shut, and for a moment the world seemed reduced to four walls, a thin mattress, and the dim glow of a single yellow bulb humming above his head. He sat on the bench, his wrists aching from the cuffs, the sting of humiliation heavier than the steel. The courtroom's noise had vanished. Here silence pressed in like a second set of chains. A minute passed, maybe two, before footsteps echoed down the corridor. Slow, deliberate, with the rhythm of someone who wanted his presence felt before he even arrived. It was Officer Grant. He stepped into the light, arms crossed over his chest, his shadow stretching long across the bars. "I used to be a soldier," he said, his voice flat, almost conversational. "I've put cuffs on men tougher than you. Smarter, too. Black lawyers just like you. Every one of them thought they could fight the system. Every one of them failed. The words weren't shouted. That was the cruelest part. They were delivered like facts, simple and undeniable. His eyes carried the certainty of someone who believed he was right because history had proved him so time and time again. David didn't answer. His hands clenched, then loosened, his breath steady but heavy. Grant tilted his head, smirked, tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You'll learn. This place doesn't change. Men like you don't win here." With that, he turned and left, the sound of his boots fading into the corridor. The silence returned, thicker now, poisoned by those words. David lowered his head into his hands. For the first time since the hearing began, the weight pressed too hard, and he let himself feel it. Maybe they were right. Maybe all of them were right. Men like him didn't win in rooms like that. Not when the rules were written to shut him out before he even stepped inside. The memory came unbidden, sharp as broken glass. He was a boy again, standing at the edge of a march with his father's hand gripping his own. The crowd had been loud that day, voices rising against injustice, chanting for rights they hadn't been granted. And then sirens, shouts, the stamp of boots. His father had been shoved into a police van, his face bleeding, but proud, his voice steady even as they dragged him away. Later, in a dim kitchen, lit only by a single bulb, his father had leaned across the table and whispered to him, "Don't let them write your worth for you, son. They'll try. Every day they'll try. But that's not their pen to hold." That memory burned now, colliding with Grant's words, with Whitmore's sneer, with Lena's desperate plea. It made his chest tighten. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to hold on to it. But doubt crept in, sly and suffocating. Maybe his father had been wrong. Maybe the world was too heavy for one man to lift. David closed his eyes, drew in a long breath, and held it until the air shook in his lungs. No. He could almost hear his father's voice again, stubborn, unbroken, even in chains. "They can cage your body, but not your spirit." The cell seemed smaller now, but his resolve grew larger inside it. He sat up straight, placed his feet firmly on the concrete floor, and let the air out slow. The pain, the shame, the fear, they didn't disappear. They settled around him like weights. But instead of dragging him down, they anchored him. He whispered to himself a promise, more than a prayer: "I won't let them write me out of this story. Not now." There in that narrow room under the flickering bulb and behind iron bars, David made his decision. He would not surrender. He would not let Whitmore's order be the last word spoken over him. He would fight, not because victory was guaranteed, but because some fights are worth losing if it means refusing to kneel. And in that moment alone, but not broken, the course of what came next was set. Back in the courtroom, the air felt heavier without David at the table. His chair sat empty, the leather back creaking slightly as though it missed the weight it was meant to carry. The judge shuffled papers, pretending the disruption had never happened. But the silence that followed was not routine. It was charged, restless. A few white attorneys leaned toward each other in the gallery, their whispers just sharp enough to cut through the quiet. "He's finished. Arrested in his own case, he'll never work here again." Another shook his head almost with pity. "He just destroyed his career in one afternoon." Their words weren't shouted, but they carried the kind of certainty that comes from people who believe the system is theirs to define. To them, David wasn't a colleague or a peer. He was a warning. At the defense table, Lena's hands trembled against the wood. Her face was pale with panic, her eyes darting from Whitmore to the bailiff's door where David had been taken. She pushed herself to her feet, voice breaking. "Please, someone has to help him. He hasn't done anything wrong. He was defending me. He was defending the law. How can you let them take him like that?" Her words fell into a void. The lawyers in their press suits didn't move. The spectators shifted uncomfortably but kept their eyes lowered. Even the jurors glanced sideways at one another, waiting for anyone to respond. No one did. The silence became its own kind of verdict. From the second row, a man's voice broke softly through the stillness. He was black, older, his shoulders bent with the weight of years. His words weren't loud, but they carried across the benches. "I know that feeling," he said. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor. "And I stayed silent my whole life, because I was afraid." The honesty in it was almost unbearable. It wasn't defiance, it was confession. And in his admission, the truth of the room sharpened. It wasn't just Judge Whitmore who chained men like David. It was the silence of everyone who sat and let it happen. Then suddenly movement. A young white man in the gallery shot to his feet, his chair clattering backward. His voice rang louder than anyone's had dared. "This is wrong. You can't just throw him in a cell for doing his job." For a heartbeat, hope flickered. You could feel the crowd draw in a collective breath, as if wondering if this was the moment when silence finally cracked. But Officer Grant was already there, striding from the side of the room, jaw clenched. He barked across the benches, his words like steel. "Sit down, unless you want to be cuffed and dragged out with him." The young man froze, his fists clenched at his sides. His chest rose and fell, anger battling with fear. But when Grant took another step closer, the fire in his eyes dimmed. Slowly he sat. The chair squealed against the floor as he pulled it back under him, and the room sank into silence again. It was more than silence, though. It was fear layered over everyone like a heavy blanket. The young man stared down at his shoes. The older witness lowered his head further, and Lena collapsed back into her seat, tears streaming silently down her face. I remember looking around and realizing something important. Injustice doesn't thrive only on the power of the oppressor. It survives on the quiet of the bystanders, on every lowered head, every averted gaze, every person who whispers, "That's just how it is," instead of saying enough. And in that room, the silence was deafening. It wasn't just David who was on trial. It was all of us. They brought David back into the courtroom in cuffs, Grant's hand clamped around his arm like a vice. The murmurs rose, then died as the door thudded shut behind them. Whitmore sat high above it all, the gavel close at hand, the robe falling in perfect lines like a wall you couldn't climb. He didn't look at Lena. He barely looked at David. He stared at the clock, as if time itself worked for him. "Bailiff," he said, voice flat, "remove the defendant's counsel from these proceedings." Grant shifted his grip, angling David toward the side door that led to the hallway and eventually the county lockup. The chain between the cuffs rattled. Lena stood halfway, then sat again, her courage caught in her throat. The young man who had tried to speak earlier gripped the edge of his chair, knuckles white. The older black man in the second row pressed his hands together, as if prayer could hold a man in place. Grant took a step. That was when the outer doors burst wide. A gust of air rushed in, lifting the papers on the clerk's desk. Heads turned as a line of men and women in dark suits swept down the aisle with the quiet certainty of people who never wondered if they belonged. Their cases were slim and immaculate. The folder one of them carried flashed a gold seal, bright as a coin in the morning sun. It wasn't the shine you noticed first. It was the composure. "Identify yourselves," Whitmore snapped, the calm shaved off his voice. The lead visitor didn't flinch. He was middle-aged, clean-shaven, a posture that said he'd spent his life standing before power without bowing. He set a document on the clerk's desk and spoke clearly enough for the room to hear. "By directive of the Supreme Court of the United States," he said, "we serve notice that Attorney David Carter has been summoned to appear in a matter of national significance. Effective immediately, he is not subject to detention by this court that would prevent his compliance." The words didn't echo. They settled. The clerk blinked, then looked to Whitmore, then back to the gold seal. You could feel the room lean toward the paper as if gravity had shifted. Grant's grip loosened by instinct alone. "Excuse me." Whitmore's chair creaked forward. "This is a county court. You will address this tribunal with respect. On what grounds do you presume to interrupt my proceedings?" The lead visitor's face didn't change. He tapped the page once, not a flourish, just a fact. "On the grounds of the nation's highest court, Your Honor." The room exhaled at once. A woman gasped. Someone's pen fell and skittered across the floor. Lena's hands flew to her mouth. Then the tears came sudden and helpless, as if the body recognized hope before the mind dared to name it. Supreme Court. Whitmore's voice cracked on the word he'd kept for himself all his life. Color drained from his face. He looked to the clerk for rescue and found only the steady glint of the gold seal pressed into the page like a thumbprint of authority. The lead envoy didn't step closer. He didn't need to. "Attorney Carter has been noticed for argument in Washington. His presence is required. Any restraint imposed here that impedes that obligation is unlawful." You could almost hear the room thinking, Washington, the Supreme Court, the same man this judge had ordered to the floor. Grant let go first. Not all the way, his fingers hovered unsure, but enough that David could straighten. The cuffs still held. The posture didn't. David didn't look triumphant. He looked the way a man looks when a storm breaks and he's still standing in the rain. He turned his head slightly toward Lena. It was the smallest movement. She caught it like a lifeline. Whitmore found the gavel, then set it down without striking. He tried for dignity and came up with delay. Clerk, let the record reflect. The record, the envoy said gently, already reflects what it needs to. Silence rolled across the benches like a tide going out. The young white man who'd tried to speak earlier let out a breath he'd been holding for minutes that felt like hours. The older black man bowed his head, and when he lifted it, his eyes were wet, though no tear fell. It wasn't triumph. It was recognition. This day would be remembered. Whitmore reached for the narrowest road left to him. "Bailiff," he said, voice gathering, "Starch remove Mr. Carter's restraints at once. This court will not be accused of impropriety." Grant's jaw twitched. He found the key, worked the cuffs, and the steel gave way with a reluctant click. The red marks on David's wrist stood out like ink. Grant looked away at the ceiling, at the floor, anywhere but the man he had held. David rubbed his wrist once and then let his hands drop. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The envoy slid a second document across the desk to the clerk. "Will require Mr. Carter's immediate release from any custody and an acknowledgement from this court that he will be permitted to travel to Washington without interference." Whitmore nodded before he meant to. Habit is a powerful thing. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if searching for a version of himself that could command this moment and failing to find it. "Very well," he said at last, the words arriving brittle and late. "This court acknowledges the notice." He swallowed the word he never expected to say. "Mr. Carter may depart." The gallery burst not into cheers, not quite, but into a loud, uncontainable human sound. Gasps, whispers, tumbling over each other, a few claps that died as quickly as they started. It wasn't rebellion. It was release. The weight that had sat on everyone's chest lifted by a fraction. Lena stood again, and this time her legs didn't wobble. She didn't run to David. She didn't dare. She just looked at him the way a person looks at a horizon they had been told didn't exist. Whitmore tried to recover a scrap of control. "We will reconvene on the matter of Ms. Morris at a later date," he announced, as if the calendar could launder what had just happened. No one wrote it down. The only thing anyone recorded was the look that crossed his face when he realized he was no longer the tallest thing in the room. Grant stepped back, palms open, and for one bare second he met David's eyes. There was something like confusion there, like a man who had rehearsed the ending and just discovered a new scene had been added. David reached for his briefcase. The leather creaked. As he pulled the handle free, the long envelope he'd tucked there that morning slid into view, its edge catching the light. He had never waved it like a flag. He had never needed to. The truth was doing the waving for him now. The envoy gave a small nod, a professional courtesy that carried more respect than any flourish. "Mr. Carter," he said, "will be in touch regarding scheduling." "Understood," David replied, his voice even. He turned back just for a moment toward the bench. He didn't gloat. He didn't glare. He simply offered the smallest of acknowledgments, the kind a man gives another when the facts have spoken and there's nothing left to add. Whitmore stared at him, and for the first time since the day began, there was no smirk to string along the corners of his mouth. Only a hollow question, unspoken. How did the ground move under my feet? The answer was everywhere, on the gold seal, in the loosened shoulders of the gallery, in the marks around David's wrists. Power had not left the room. It had been correctly named. As David stepped away from counsel table, the crowd parted, not dramatically, but instinctively, the way people shift when something fragile is being carried through a doorway. The older black man stood just enough to be seen and dipped his head. The young white man lifted his gaze and didn't look away this time. Lena's tears slipped free and found her smile. And in that small county courtroom, where a judge thought his word was the horizon, the story outgrew the room. The case was no longer just a local skirmish. The line between humiliation and history had been crossed. You could feel it in your bones, a snap, a new current taking hold. People would leave that day and tell the story 10 different ways, but the core would be the same. A black attorney was ordered to the floor, and moments later, the highest court in the land called him up. The leap from tile to marble was not distance. It was direction. The envoy gathered his team. The clerk stamped the acknowledgement. The gavel stayed still. And David Carter, uncuffed, unbowed, walked toward a door he hadn't opened yet. carrying a case that now belonged to more than one woman, more than one courtroom, more than one town. The room watched him go, the hush no longer fear but awe. That was the second, turning less noisy than the first but far more permanent. From that instant on, every breath in that courthouse had to answer to a larger sky. The chains were gone, but the marks still traced David's wrists. He stood slow and deliberate, as though rising from the very weight that had pressed him down minutes earlier. The gallery watched in silence, every breath held, as if no one dared break the fragile moment that had settled over the room. Whitmore shifted behind the bench, his gavel within reach, his robe falling stiff around him. He had ruled this courtroom for years, accustomed to voices lowering when he entered, to eyes dropping when he spoke. But now he was looking at a man who refused to drop his gaze. David turned fully toward him, shoulders squared, chin lifted. His eyes carried something sharper than defiance, they carried truth. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, deep, each word placed like a stone across a river. "You can put me in chains," David said, "but you cannot chain justice." The words didn't echo, they rooted. They filled every corner of that room, settling on the benches, the walls, the very air. And then nothing. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just stillness. For the first time that day, Judge Whitmore did not answer. His hand twitched toward the gavel, then pulled back. His face shone with a thin film of sweat, his jaw tight, his composure slipping grain by grain. He blinked too often, his eyes darting to the clerk, to the seal of the Supreme Court still lying on the desk, then back to David, unable to hold, unable to look away. The courtroom felt inverted. The man who once towered over the chamber seemed smaller now, his robe more like a costume than a crown. And David, the man forced to kneel, now stood taller than the wood and marble around him. I looked at the gallery. Some people leaned forward, their mouths parted as if they'd forgotten to breathe. A woman pressed her hands to her lips. The older black man from before closed his eyes, a tear sliding down one cheek, not from sorrow, but from recognition. The young white man who had been silenced earlier let out a sound, half laugh, half sob, and shook his head as if saying finally, it wasn't victory yet, but it was more than resistance. It was reclamation. Whitmore reached for his water glass, his fingers trembling slightly against the stem. He cleared his throat, but no words followed. For years, this was his stage, his script always obeyed. And now his silence said more than his sentences ever had. The people in that room knew it too. You could see it in their faces, in the way their eyes glistened, in the way their shoulders straightened, as if something long buried had risen with David's words. He had turned humiliation into strength, and that strength was spilling into them. Lena's tears were still fresh, but her expression had changed. She wasn't just weeping for what had been done to him. She was seeing something she didn't dare imagine hours ago, a man standing unbroken where others had been forced to bend. And Whitmore knew it. The sweat on his brow wasn't from the lights. It was from the mirror David had just held up. For the first time, the judge of this room was the one judge. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with everything unspoken, the fear, the anger, the hope. It was filled with the truth that once spoken could not be taken back. And in that stillness, David didn't move. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply stood unchained, his eyes fixed on the man who had tried to break him. The balance of the room had shifted. Everyone felt it. Justice wasn't a robe or a gavel anymore. It was a man's voice, steady and unyielding, declaring the one thing no cell, no chain, no order could erase. That was the moment people would remember. Not the cuffs, not the gavel, but the sight of a man facing the judge who humiliated him and refusing to bow. By the next morning, the story had already left the county courthouse. It moved faster than anyone inside that room could have imagined. Phones buzzed, headlines flashed across screens. Radios repeated it until even people who had never set foot in a courtroom could recite the details. Black attorney handcuffed in local court, revealed to be at the center of a Supreme Court case. The phrasing changed depending on who said it. Some papers framed it as a scandal, others as a tragedy, but to most people it sounded like a spark. On street corners, in coffee shops, in church basements, people argued. Some shook their heads, calling David a troublemaker, a man who pushed too hard and brought the punishment on himself. He wanted attention, they said. He should have stayed quiet. Look where it got him. But others heard something different in the story. They heard resilience. They saw the marks on his wrists and the fire in his words and claimed him as a symbol. He spoke what we've been too afraid to say, a woman told a reporter on camera. They chained him, and he still stood taller than that judge. By afternoon, the courthouse steps were no longer empty. Reporters gathered cameras, flashing microphones thrust forward as though the bricks themselves could talk. Local residents lingered too, not all of them sure why they came, only that something important had happened, and they wanted to be near the place where it began. Lena stepped out of the courthouse later that day, her release only temporary, but her face steadier than it had been in weeks. David walked beside her. His jacket rumpled his wrists, still raw, but his stride unbroken. She touched his arm, her voice low but fierce. "If you don't give up, I won't give up either," she told him. He nodded once, a quiet promise exchanged in public view. Cameras caught the moment. The picture ran on evening broadcasts, her tears mingling with his steady gaze. For some it was just an image. For others it was evidence of hope. The story spread further. Civil rights groups picked it up, issuing statements that what had happened in that small courtroom was not just misconduct, it was a reminder of wounds that never healed. The local NRACP chapter called for accountability. A national journalist wrote an editorial, "If the chains of prejudice still rattle in our courtrooms, how can we claim justice for all the voices multiplied?" Black churches spoke of David from their pulpits, calling his stand an act of faith as much as law. Community organizers invoked his name at rallies, not because he had won yet, but because he had refused to bow. Students scribbled his words, "You cannot chain justice," on poster boards and marched with them down sidewalks, their chants echoing through streets lined with shops and startled onlookers. Still, not everyone was convinced. On talk radio, callers raged about outsiders stirring trouble, painting David as a man who had embarrassed the system. They called him arrogant, accused him of exploiting race for personal gain. But even those voices added fuel to the fire, because each word repeated his name carried his story further. I stood outside that courthouse and listened. It was different from the silence that had filled the room the day before. This was noisy, chaotic, alive. People were no longer lowering their eyes, they were raising their voices, some against, but many for. The fight was no longer just about Lena's case or David's humiliation. It was about the meaning of justice itself. Inside, Judge Whitmore sat in chambers, blinds drawn, his phone ringing with questions he could not answer. For years he had been the final word in his courtroom. Now the world had turned its gaze on him, and his decisions were no longer swallowed quietly by the walls. And out in the streets, the sense grew clearer by the hour. This was no longer one man's battle. It had become something larger, something no gavel could silence. That was the beginning of the greater trial, not the one listed on the docket, but the one written in hearts and voices. A trial where the jury was the public, the evidence was history, and the verdict would shape what came next. Washington felt larger than weather that morning air. Crisp stone, bright the steps of the Supreme Court, carrying a hush that had nothing to do with silence. People gathered at the base of the columns like they were approaching a lighthouse. Reporters waited. Clerks moved with practiced calm. And then David Carter climbed the last stair and disappeared through the doors. Inside, the chamber seemed carved out of time. The justices took their seats beneath the frieze robes, falling black and even. The sound that followed the soft slide of papers, the brief click of a pen, was as close to ceremony as the law allows. Lena sat behind counsel's table, hands clasped, a mother's prayer folded between her fingers. I sat farther back, where citizens sit, where witnesses become listeners, and history does the speaking. When David stood, he did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room raised itself to meet him. "May it please the court," he began, the familiar cadence carrying more than courtesy. "My client, Miss Morris, stands accused on the thinnest thread of conjecture evidence, bent to fit suspicion rather than truth. The law requires probable cause. What she received instead was prejudice." He walked the facts the way a careful hand checks the beam of a house, the timestamp that didn't match the camera outage, that somehow lasted only as long as it needed to the shifting story that collapsed under its own revisions. He pressed them into place until they made a shape no one could ignore. Then he paused, and the pause had purpose. Before this case reached Washington, he said it stood in a small county courtroom. There, for insisting on the rights guaranteed to every citizen, I was ordered to the floor and cuffed. I raised that not for sympathy, but for context. When a court treats a defense as disruption, when it chains an officer of the court for insisting on the law, we are not dealing with a single mistake. We are confronting a system that confuses authority with justice. He let the words settle, no flourish, just wait. You could feel the room lean forward an inch. A justice asked about standards. David answered with case law so clean it sounded inevitable. Another pressed him on remedy. He drew the line from violation to repair with the kind of logic that doesn't argue, it reveals. Through it all, Lena watched him the way a person looks at a bridge during a storm, trusting each cable, every bolt. And then David asked the question he had carried from the county tile to this marble floor. If justice can be chained in a small room where few are watching, he said, who among us is safe when no one is? The sentence didn't echo, it landed. A clerk stilled a pen, stopped mid-note. Even the room's old air seemed to hold. Silence followed, not empty, not cold. Full. The kind of silence that says the truth has been named out loud, and the next word belongs to conscience. Chief Justice Rowland leaned forward, hands steepled, the lines at his eyes deepening, as if carved by years of listening. When he spoke, the voice was measured, but the measure held steel. Counsel Rowland said the law is not a shield for those already seated in high chairs, nor a weapon for those who wield a gavel as if it were rank. It is a promise to the governed to each citizen, especially when power would prefer convenience. We are not here to preserve a pecking order. We are here to ensure justice. He turned slightly, addressing the room as much as the record. Today that promise is honored. The opinion was read clear, direct, free of anything ornamental. The evidence against Lena did not meet constitutional standards. The charge was vacated and dismissed with prejudice. The court referred the conduct of the lower tribunal for review. The language was restrained, the message wasn't. Ms. Morris Rowland concluded, you leave this court as you arrived in life presumed innocent, and now legally recognized as such. Lena's breath left her in a sound that was almost a laugh, almost a sob. She covered her mouth, eyes wide with the shock of relief. David didn't touch her. This was not a place for embraces, but he tipped his head once, as if to say, you're free. The clerk called the next case, but no one truly heard it yet. Something had lifted and didn't return. In the back, a man exhaled so loudly it made the pew creak. A woman wiped at her cheek with the edge of her sleeve, pretending it was dust. News moved faster than footsteps. By the time we reached the steps, the word had already reached the crowd, acquittal, referral, restraint, rebuked. Cameras found faces. Microphones found sentences that could fit into a headline. But what I remember most was not the noise. It was the look on David's face, not triumph, not even vindication, steadiness. The same steadiness that had carried him through the heckling, the cuffs, the stare down. The steadiness that says the work is larger than the win. Behind us, the building held its calm. Ahead, the city kept moving. Somewhere in a quiet office, a judge in a county robe stared at a notice he never expected to see. The suspension would be temporary, the inquiry methodical. But the certainty had cracked. A courtroom is not a kingdom. People on the steps began to clap, soft at first, then fuller, not for spectacle, but for release. A mother hugged her child a little tighter. A student raised a poster with a line scrawled in blue, "You cannot chain justice." For the first time, it felt less like a slogan and more like a record of what we had witnessed. The day didn't end with a shout. It ended with breath, released, shared, restored. And in that breath, all the pressure of the earlier rooms, county wood and fluorescent light, finally gave way to a wider sky. The great doors of the Supreme Court opened, and David stepped into the daylight. The marble steps beneath him glowed in the sun, but the noise outside did not explode into cheers. It was quieter than that, something deeper. A hush filled with respect, as though people understood that loudness would not honor the weight of what had just happened. The crowd parted as he walked down every step, slow but steady. For a moment, the chains of yesterday seemed like a memory from another life. Yet the faint red lines on his wrists remained reminders, carved into skin proof, that justice had to survive even when bound. One by one, people moved closer. A man in a worker's jacket reached out his hand. "You gave us something back," he whispered. Another woman touched his arm and said, "You gave us hope again." Their words weren't shouted. They were spoken like prayers, intimate, almost private, offered in gratitude. Lena appeared through the doors a moment later, her little girl clinging to her side. When she saw David, she couldn't hold back anymore. She ran to him, her daughter in her arms, tears streaming freely. She pressed his hand between hers. "Thank you," she whispered, voice broken with relief. "You didn't just save me. You gave my child her mother back." The girl buried her face against Lena's shoulder, but before they stepped away, she looked at David. Her small eyes, wide and wondering, seemed to ask a question she couldn't yet put into words. And David smiled gently enough to tell her, "You're safe." He lifted his gaze, then past the crowd, past the steps to the sky, stretching clear and endless. His lips moved quietly, just enough for those closest to hear. "I didn't give up, Dad. I kept the fight." It wasn't a speech. It wasn't for the cameras. It was for the man who once told him not to let anyone else hold the pen that writes his worth. It was a promise fulfilled, carried from a kitchen table decades ago to the highest court in the land. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward, but David didn't rush to answer. Instead, he paused, and when he finally spoke, his words weren't about himself. Justice, he said, doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need chains or gavels to prove its strength. Justice lives where truth is spoken and where people choose not to look away. The words hung in the air, unpolished, plain, but stronger for it. The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in the sound of release. Applause mixed with tears, cheers with the quiet nods of those too moved to speak. Some wept openly, others simply stood taller, as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. You could see it in their faces. This was not just David's victory or Lena's. It was something shared, a verdict carried out in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. As the day faded, people drifted away from the steps, carrying the story like a flame passed from hand to hand. They would tell it at dinner tables, in churches, in classrooms. They would tell it not as gossip, but as testimony that once in a small courtroom, justice had been chained, and in Washington it broke free. I left with them, my own heart unsettled in the best way. Because what stayed with me wasn't only David's defiance, or Lena's tears, or even the Chief Justice's words. It was the reminder that silence feeds injustice, and voice, even the trembling kind, starves it. David Carter walked down those steps, not as a man untouched by struggle, but as a man who carried scars honestly and turned them into strength. He didn't roar. He didn't rage. He stood and he endured, and he reminded us all that endurance can be the loudest form of courage. And so the echo lingered long after the cameras packed up, long after the marble cooled. In the night air, justice is not in the volume of a gavel, but in the quiet conviction of those who refuse to bow. That's what I carried with me leaving that place. A mix of satisfaction and a fire that wouldn't quite die. Because the truth is, the story didn't end on those steps. It walked home with every single one of us. Justice doesn't always roar. It often stands quietly in the truth, waiting for someone brave enough to protect it. Today's story reminds us that dignity can survive chains, that courage can rise even in silence, and that hope belongs to all of us if we choose not to look away. If this story moved you, please take a moment to hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful tales that honor truth, resilience, and the fight for justice. Your support means more than numbers. It fuels our team's heart and gives us the strength to keep creating meaningful stories that matter. Remember this when you think of Mr. Mac's Stories. Think of voices that refuse to be silenced, and stories that remind us justice still lives in each of us.